I'm just waiting for folks to come in, so we're almost ready to start. Okay. Good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever is appropriate to your time zone. I'm Olga Oliker. I direct the Europe and Central Asia program at the International Crisis Group. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, but somehow still found their way to our event, Crisis Group is a global, non-governmental, and independent organization dedicated to the prevention of violent conflict and, through our research and advocacy, to shaping policies that can prevent and mitigate wars and other violence. Today's event is focused on Russia's continuing full-scale war against Ukraine and the diplomacy surrounding it. This is, of course, prompted by the fact that this weekend saw some 100 countries send representatives to the Swiss mountains for the latest in what has been a series of international meetings spearheaded by Kyiv to discuss the war and to seek support for Ukraine's vision of a settlement, for a peace formula that was developed in Kyiv. This meeting has ended with most, but not all, of the participants signing on to a communique, which, among other things, affirms that Ukrainian territorial integrity has to be the basis of any settlement. Moscow, which had not been invited, greeted the start of the summit late last week by actually arguing the opposite, that any talks were possible only if Ukraine accepted Russian control of all the Ukrainian territory that Moscow claims, which is, of course, more Ukrainian territory than Moscow actually holds. To unpack what the summit does and does not mean and what the prospects are for diplomacy, I'm thrilled to have this all-star panel of my colleagues here with us today. They include Alyssa de Carbonell, who is the Deputy Director of the Europe and Central Asia Program, Richard Gowan, our UN Director, Simon Schlegel, our Senior Analyst for Ukraine, and Oleg Ignatov, our Senior Analyst for Russia. What we're going to be doing is talking amongst ourselves for 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will open up for a question and answer session with all of you lovely guests. If guests want to ask a question, they should type it into the Q&A box and include, please, your name and affiliation so that we can read all of that out along with your question. Please do be aware that this call is being recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel, which means that that is where it will be available in the future going forward. So with that, I would like to get started. So this is a Ukrainian initiative, and it's kind of a truism you hear very often that you don't negotiate with your allies or your friends, you have to negotiate with your adversaries. Except, of course, you do have to negotiate with your allies and your friends and your prospective partners, because the least you need to negotiate positions with them, and at the most you're trying to convince them to be on your side, which is what Ukraine has been trying to do with this series of meetings. So on the Western side of things, if you were following the coverage of this summit, we got a lot of quotes from a lot of Western leaders stating their unwavering support for Ukraine. Alyssa, thoughts on whether this is particularly meaningful?
Well, I think it is useful to look at the wider context around the summit. So the summit came after a week of successes for Ukraine, I think we can say. There was the G7 meeting at which leaders agreed to extend a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, which is backed by which they're going to raise on the back of Russian frozen assets. There were some bilateral security deals signed with Japan and the US. There's a widening of sanctions by the United States and efforts to close sanction loopholes. So all of these things were a good momentum last week going into the so-called Summit on Peace, not a peace summit. I think, if we look at the summit itself, it wasn't really an effort to discuss peace or a kickstarting of a peace process, to state the obvious. Despite the title, it was really about galvanizing global opinion behind the core parts of Ukraine's peace formula. And it was a major gathering, but I think there's really no hiding that the list of participants wasn't quite as long or as high level as Zelensky might have wanted. He grumbled a bit ahead of the summit that Biden himself wasn't there, although Kamala Harris was there in his stead. He did manage at the very last minute to get Saudi Arabia to participate on the level of their foreign minister, but only by going there for sort of a last-ditch trip to try to convince them. So in that sense, it's kind of a mixed result. I'm sure we'll hear more about the participation. But in terms of showing that he had Western backing, yes, I think, that's true. Whether it was a little bit of a Western echo chamber and he wasn't really able to show in the same way as he would have liked to that Russia was isolated, and that other countries were willing to put pressure on Russia. I think that's unclear. We can talk maybe also a little bit about later the difference between when this initiative started a year ago in 2022, when Ukraine's prospects were very different, and the situation today when it's a little bit more on the back foot. Maybe later.
No, there's a lot for us to talk about. I think what I actually want to do right now is go to Richard and dig a little deeper into everybody who wasn't Western at this meeting. Why were they there? What were, you could hear from the pronouncements of the Western states why they were there, right? They were there to make a real show of unity and support for Ukraine. You got a much more mixed story from all of the people representing countries in Africa, Latin America, East Asia, South Asia. What were they saying and thinking?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that a lot of the countries of the so-called Global South just didn't turn up. There were about 40 countries there from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, but Switzerland had sent out at least 70 more invitations to countries that didn't show. Now, the Ukrainians have said that is because Russia and China were leaning on countries, especially I think in Asia, not to attend. But my read is that for a lot of states, this probably just wasn't a huge priority. And I think that is a worrying sign. But of those that did turn up, I think they split into two groups. There was a solid chunk of around 30 countries from outside Europe that have been pretty consistently supportive of Ukraine. And those include countries with close security ties to the US, like Kenya, for example, or Liberia. That what we were hearing from those states, the supporters of Ukraine, was very much in line with what we were hearing from the Europeans. And there were some good speeches. I think if you search for the speech that Boric, the president of Chile, gave, he gave a very nice, very articulate defense of Ukraine's rights to territorial integrity and sovereignty, but framed it in terms of international law. And he actually threw in a reference to Gaza as well, just to show that he's not 100% with the US on other topics. So that group, I think, was favorable. What was interesting was that there was another group of about 12 countries that seemed to have turned up to show skepticism with the process. And these countries included India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, who were present, generally at the level of a foreign minister or below. But they talked a lot about the need for dialogue. They talked a lot about the need for including Russia, and they didn't sign on to the final communique that came out of the summit, which reasserted Ukraine's right for peace, based on territorial integrity. So there'd been quite a lot of concern that those countries wouldn't come at all. The Indians only signed on very late. The Saudis signed on right at the last minute. But actually, even by turning up, they slightly complicated the process because they did indicate that they're not fully on board with the Western program when it comes to peace for Ukraine.
Thank you. So Simon, I want to pull on the thread with you. Do you think the Ukrainians are disappointed in what they got? I mean, this is supposed to be not just about the countries that everybody knows back Ukraine, demonstrating they back Ukraine. It's supposed to be showing that there's a global unity around Ukraine, that its positions, and the fact that not everybody even would sign a communique pledging that peace means Ukraine's territorial integrity. I mean, did this all backfire on Kyiv, or is it overall still a win? And if so, why?
I think it shows a way forward, and it also probably shows where Ukraine has to put in a lot more work in the future. It does look, of course, in terms of numbers, as a bit of a disappointment for Kyiv, because only 80 countries signed this communique compared to more than 140 countries that signed on to that voted for the UN resolution at the start of the invasion that also demands Ukraine's territorial integrity. But this communique is also going a bit further than those UN resolutions to which it refers, by the way. It picks out 3 areas that the organizers in Ukraine thought that they would be able to gain the interest of countries outside the West. These are food security, nuclear security in particular, which in this communique get fleshed out by being tied to Ukraine's territorial integrity. So instead of talking about principles and international law, this communique goes further and states what these actually would mean if spelled out. For example, for the nuclear security, the communique tells that Ukraine would have to regain control of its Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is currently under Russian occupation. It also spells out that for granting global food security, Ukraine would have to gain control or regain control over its Azov Sea coast, which is a strategically important part of the territory that Russia holds in Ukraine currently. So it is a different type of, it's more concrete than the UN resolutions, and therefore it's a step back in terms of numbers, but it's maybe a step forward in terms of quality in spelling out. And it's also a step forward from this very rigid list of points that Kyiv initiated this process with, because it refers to this 10-point list, but also to other peace proposals that might be out there. And it also clearly formulates the goal of getting to a dialogue with all parties, that presumably means with Russia as well. So it is more contagious than the original UN resolutions, and therefore, yes, it's a loss in numbers, but it's a gain in substance, perhaps.
Thanks so much, Simon. So Oleg, Putin, prior to the start of the summit, made his own announcement, as I said earlier, that peace requires Ukraine to accept Russian control of the territories Russia claims, but doesn't entirely control, and also that Ukraine has to pledge to neutrality, et cetera, et cetera. What was he trying to accomplish with that statement? Was he trying, because, historically, Russia and Putin himself, they've talked about being open to negotiations. They've talked about the need for Ukraine to accept new realities. But by spelling out what he wants and the fact that he wants more than he actually has on the battlefield, I think that what that made clear is that Russia is absolutely not interested in making any concessions whatsoever, rather than that it is open to negotiations. Is that what he was trying to say, or is there something else going on?
So yes, of course, I think it was very calculated message, and Russians have always been very careful about their policy planning. First of all, I think it was a signal to the global South. Putin really believes that they are less interested in Ukraine's territorial integrity than in ending the war as quickly as possible. He thinks that they have no interests in Ukraine membership in NATO, and they don't have big stakes in European security. Secondly, I think Putin is signaling to the broader Western audience. He's saying that Russia's goals in this war are limited, that Russia has no plans to end Ukraine's existence as a sovereign state, that Russia doesn't plan to attack NATO countries, that Russia doesn't plan to occupy all of Ukraine or even Kharkiv and Odessa, according to his words, yes. And the third thing, I think he is saying that the next, and he was very blunt about this, that the next peace proposal will be worse because Putin believes that Ukraine can't win the war of attrition. And Russians keep saying about this since 2022. And actually, this proposal is worse than the Istanbul package, that it's worse in terms of territorial concessions. It's worse that Ukraine could have gotten if it had agreed to the Istanbul package. And I think the fourth point is that it was a signal to the Russian audience. It's also very important. Putin is telling Russian citizens that his goals in this war are realistic in terms of like security concerns as he understands them, as Russia's security concerns, that he's ready to end the war, but the problem is again with the West and Ukraine. And in that sense, of course, it's very convenient signal for Russian society. So if you look at the polls, Russians could be getting tired of this war, but at the same time, they don't want Russia to lose. And in this situation, domestically, Putin can continue blaming the West and Ukraine for not wanting the peace.
Thanks, Oleg. I mean, I do want to say that now that the New York Times has published the text of the April draft that was not agreed but discussed, it wasn't just Ukraine not agreeing to it, right? I mean, it was Ukraine and Russia prospectively committing a whole bunch of other countries to things. So not only did those two countries not actually agree on the text, I mean, this text was a long way from being a real agreement because it included commitments to others. So, but I take your point that, you know, Russia now wants to demand more territory than it wanted to demand when it was basically being forced to withdraw. Well, I mean, that's not a surprise. The battlefield kind of determines what's possible. But I also want to go to Alyssa and ask what she saw in Western responses, if any, to this Putin statement. Do they agree that Russia has more staying power?
Well, certainly the response to, Putin's demands, as we can call them, was really very much to see them as what they were, a request for Ukraine's capitulation. I think Kamala Harris called it, a call for surrender. So there wasn't much on the part of Western leaders who were present at the peace summit and who were, showing their support for Ukraine in taking those comments seriously. However, as Oleg pointed out, they're not necessarily directed at those leaders. We've seen internal divisions within the EU, within the US. I think the comments also lend fodder to skeptics of continued support for Ukraine within the West. We're going to see elections in a number of countries, in France, my country, very soon. So that's part of it. And then, as Oleg pointed out, it sort of paints Kyiv, not Moscow, as the intransient party. And so if we're looking at what Putin really wants, I do, just to build on what Oleg said, I do think it's worth pointing out that Putin has really made this cornerstone of his political legitimacy. He has reoriented the economy, trade around this. He's created a new cadre of loyalists through these changes. And so it's very difficult to see him backing down, or he may want to pause in the fighting. There may be lots of reasons that Russia would like to take some of the pressure off its economy, off its own mobilization, but not necessarily an end to this conflict with Ukraine, but also the wider West, as he has portrayed it to Russians at home.
Thank you. So as Alyssa mentioned earlier, as we've discussed, right, this is the latest in a series of summits, or not summits, latest in a series of meetings. This was the most summity of them because it actually involved heads of state, though not as many heads of state as Kyiv wanted. Is this it for this initiative? You know, kind of you brought a few heads of state in, got a communique, but you know, all the meetings have basically said the same things, and the interest has dropped off, as you had said, Richard. I mean, the Swiss picked this up presumably hoping to get more out of it. They didn't. So, Richard, do you see this as kind of the end of this initiative, or do you think there's going to be more? And how would it work?
Well, the big question going into the meeting, and still an unanswered question, is whether there is any way to hold another summit in this format with some form of Russian representation. And the Swiss made it very clear that they saw this event as creating the groundwork for a future summit to which Russia could come. Now, the Ukrainians were rather less clear about that. They did, in the last days before the summit, say that they would consider a second event with the Russians. But it was fairly clear they were saying that as part of their effort to get some of the straggling global south countries into the tent. And I'm not sure that it's something that Ukraine really wants. But the Swiss and quite a lot of the other participants in the conference at least want to hold out the prospect that they can take this communique, they can communicate it to the Russians, and they can use that as a way to draw the Russians into a further meeting. I think one of the Swiss officials involved, it may even have been the Swiss president, said that that could happen before the US elections, so that would be relatively soon. This may all just be a diplomatic fantasy. There had been talk of the Saudis hosting this follow-on event with the Russians. The Saudis hosted a lower-level discussion last year, which the Chinese attended. So I think there is a theory that if Riyadh was willing to host a follow-on summit, China might come. The Chinese very notably didn't come to Switzerland. And maybe, just maybe, the Russians would send some sort of representative for discussions. I have to say that, you know, given Putin's statement, given the fact that President Zelensky also said on Sunday that he wouldn't negotiate with the Russians until they pulled all their troops out of Ukraine, this strikes me as far-fetched. In the short term, there is probably going to be one follow-on here in New York. I think the Ukrainians are going to introduce a resolution in the General Assembly focusing on the nuclear security issue, and that will call on Russia to pull its forces back from Zaporizhia. I suspect that that will pass with roughly 80 votes, probably not a whole lot more. That will be a small additional win for the Ukrainians. But the idea of a second summit where the Russians come to talk seriously on the basis of this format is most likely a non-starter.
Oleg, do you agree? No Russians coming to any of these things, even if somehow the Chinese decide they want to participate? And if there is a way forward for the Russians and I guess the Chinese, what would it be? What would it take to have a meeting that would include both the Ukrainians and the Russians from the Russian perspective?
Look, I think that Russians tried to undermine this format deliberately. Yes, and I think it's difficult to imagine that they could participate in this format anytime in the future, because if they tried to do this in the past, why shouldn't they do it in the future? But if Saudis organize a meeting between Russians and Ukrainians in Riyadh, and both Russia and Ukraine would agree on this, I don't see any problems with this. Yes, the problem would be only with the parties of the conflict, not with but the problem with this format is it's that because from the beginning they started to deny the legitimacy of this format. And we don't remember Russia agreeing to any agreements that were reached without its participation. So I'm afraid that it's difficult to imagine a situation when Russia comes to Switzerland and there are like 18 countries or more, and there's Ukraine, and there are everybody against Russia, and Russia is against everybody. So I think they will not feel themselves comfortable, of course, in this situation, and I think they would not agree on this. But different formats, of course, different suggestions, different ideas, absolutely possible, and think they are realistic. And both sides negotiated with each other in the Istanbul package without any middleman. So, and I think what Russia is seeing and is thinking is like a bilateral format with Ukraine or bilateral format with the United States.
We're a ways away from either of those two things. Simon, do you think that the Ukrainians feel generally that they've got the diplomatic part of this war right at this point? Where do you see them going with diplomacy into the future? I mean, we've had a diplomatic push that is focused on friends and partners and allies, though sometimes critically. And we've had kind of this effort of the series of meetings, which has been really the flagship of Ukraine's efforts with everybody who's not in the regional North Atlantic. Is that what they're going to keep doing, or might there be a rethink of Ukrainian diplomacy going forward?
I think there might be a rethink in terms of timelines that they use. Ukraine has been famously pushy towards its Western partners and sometimes tested the patience of its Western partners, but also been really successful in pushing their own red lines and having them crumble time after time and getting out of these pushes what they wanted eventually. So this has really paid off, and probably a lot of people in Kyiv would say that this is the actually that is the diplomatic front that matters for Kyiv most, and that is where they've been most successful. But I think that there's also a more subtle success in Ukrainian diplomacy over the past 2.5 years. And that's the realization that with countries outside of the West, that Ukraine can be convincing to those if it takes a very different approach, a more patient approach, a more long-term approach, a more listening approach, that then they can really build ties and try to convince these countries that things like the UN Charta and its manifestation in Ukrainian territorial integrity matter for worldwide security. And Ukraine has invested a lot in a charm offensive outside of Europe. It has opened 7 embassies in African capitals over just the last 7 months, almost doubling its presence there. But this comes with the realization that this is a really long game and that it needs a lot of patience, because so far this push has not yet translated into numbers of subscribers to these communiques. For example, only a handful of African countries signed this, and only one of those with a new embassy did so. So I think the realization of these two different timelines, that Ukraine can be rather pushy towards Western countries, but it needs to invest in long-term relationships in Africa and the Middle East, in Asia and in Latin America, against a much better connected and richer Russian presence there. I think that realization is in itself a bit of a success for the Ukrainian diplomacy.
Thanks, Oleg. And I want to ask you, what about the Russians? Do they think they're doing well with diplomacy? Do we anticipate more of the same from them, or will there be changes in how the Russians engage the world?
I think a lot of things depends what will happen on the ground, yes, as a year ago. So I think diplomatically they had 4 objectives. The first was to convince China not to participate, and it seems this did not require much effort. The second thing was to persuade the BRICS countries not to participate, and in the end some did participate, yes, but did not sign the communique. And the third thing was to convince Central Asian countries, and there were different information that they approached Central Asian countries asking them not to participate, and none of them came to the event. And the fourth signal was to a broad global south, and there was also information that Russia tried to convince him not to go there. So they are deliberately, as I said, trying to undermine the support, so Ukraine's support. I think, of course, now from the if you look at the Russian statements, if you look at the Russian media, they're quite satisfied with the results of the summit.
Alyssa, do you see a Western diplomatic gap that Ukraine's backers could be trying to fill here? Or are they fine kind of just repeating the talking points they've largely been repeating for 2.5 years now? Is there something they should be doing that they're not?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are two parts probably to that. One is, the theory behind Western support and Western backing for Ukraine has been twofold. One, sort of convincing Russia and the Kremlin that that is long-term, sustainable, and really to a level in which it would allow Ukraine to fend off Russian advances, and that it would be, on the other hand, put Ukraine in a stronger position to come to the negotiating table or to seek negotiations. There's always been an idea that ultimately that's the goal. So the first part of the answer is that, that hasn't changed. I think there's been a lot of complacency and sort of magical thinking, certainly at the start of the war, about Russia's about how sanctions were going to isolate Russia, about Russia's friendships and trade ties deteriorating, about its relative ability to keep its economy going and its strength, but also about Ukraine's ability to, be successful in the counteroffensive after it gained big swaths of territory in 2022. So I think, now with the counteroffensive last year having not succeeded in a huge breakthrough, and Russia really having the upper hand on the battlefield, it's more important than ever. And those theories of I don't know, I'm not going to call them theories of victory, but the theories of Western support for Ukraine and what it's hoping to achieve haven't changed. So I think it's more important than ever that the West continue to make concrete and to put sort of action behind its rhetoric. So that's one part. And then just very quickly, in terms of outreach to the global South, think it's very difficult, as Richard and Adeg have pointed out, in terms of part of this is skepticism, anti-Western sentiment, especially in the wake of developments in the Middle East. It's become even more difficult to sort of overcome that and convince countries in other parts of the world that they have a stake. But I think it's really important to also understand that, the West has more economic weight than Russia does in some of these countries. So perhaps it could do more to really make those kinds of arguments, those kinds of realpolitik, pragmatic arguments, because at the moment what we're seeing is Russia retains these economic levers of energy sales, of grain sales to certain countries, of provision of arms in some countries, the export of nuclear power. All of these things have continued. They were there and they have continued, and that may be where Ukraine's Western backers can kind of try to fill the gap, as you say.
Thank you. So in just a very short time, I want to turn to questions. We're getting some. Please, if you are putting a question into the Q&A, do put your name and your affiliation so that we can tell people who you are and where you're from when we ask your question. But before I do that, I want to bring Richard back in, actually follow up on what Alyssa was saying. What do the countries that are not part of the regional North Atlantic want from the countries of the regional North Atlantic to get them to, to kind of counter what the Russians have to offer? And also, perhaps relatedly, but perhaps not, I would have thought the territorial integrity is one of the things that kind of is important to them, right? Oleg said that Russia is betting on these countries not caring that much about territorial integrity. But when I talk to people from countries that have a long history of having been colonized, territorial integrity is really, really quite important to them. So what's going on with that? Do they care? Do they not care?
I think in principle, the bulk of countries outside Europe do take the argument around territorial integrity very seriously. And it's worth saying that the highest level of support that Ukraine ever got at a vote in the UN General Assembly was on a resolution in late 2022 condemning Russia's efforts to annex parts of Ukraine. So the principle of territorial integrity stands strong. But I think Oleg is right, or perhaps President Putin is right, to think that for a lot of countries outside Europe, the real priority is just to get this thing to finish. And really, that's something we've been hearing from non-Western diplomats around the UN, for the best part of 2 years. There are concerns about escalation risks, but there's also just a concern that the more the war goes on, the more it is driving the West and Russia and China apart. It's creating sort of a lot of dynamics in favor of bloc politics. And a lot of smaller and middle-sized countries in Africa, in Asia, just don't want to be caught in that reality of bloc politics. They don't want to be forced to choose. And so I think in pragmatic terms, a lot of states would say, okay, territorial integrity matters, but can't you at least have a ceasefire? Can't you at least stop this war getting any worse? And I think that's the general. I think that's the general mood. The interesting question is whether some of those countries, like India and the other BRICS that did attend the Swiss summit, whether they're actually going to make any sort of new peace push of their own. There were rumors prior to the summit that the BRICS countries that would attend might table a counter proposal, a counter plan for peace based on dialogue and not referring to Ukraine's right to its territory. They didn't do that. And actually, it's notable that last week there was a BRICS foreign ministers meeting, and the communique had very little to say around Ukraine. So for the time being, it doesn't feel like the BRICS have a clear and coherent alternative peace plan. But the Chinese have been coordinating with the Brazilians, the Chinese have been coordinating with the Russians. It is still possible that if the war drags on, you will see some of the countries that demonstrated skepticism over the Swiss summit cohering around a push for peace talks without preconditions from Ukraine. And so I think that is what Kyiv will be continuing to watch a little nervously as the conflict goes on.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to start passing on some of the questions we are receiving from the audience. And one of them, I think, actually links to this. It's coming from Andy Carl, who's an independent advisor here in the United Kingdom, and who's asking if there were discussions of possible formal or informal future dialogue or negotiations. I mean, it sounds like there were expectations this would be raised, but at least formally it wasn't. Is there any reason to think there were any of these conversations informally? Has anybody heard anything like that? I mean, none of us were there, so any information we've got is gossip, but anybody have any gossip?
I mean, I think, Olia, it's worth saying that there were three priority topics on the table in Bergenstock. They were food security, nuclear security, and then exchanges of both prisoners of war, but also of civilians and children. The irony is that there are already channels for Ukraine and Russia to discuss all of those topics. there has been an ongoing discussion this year involving Ukrainian and Russian officials about whether to revive the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the UN-backed initiative from 2022 that allowed Ukraine to export its foodstuffs that sort of collapsed last year. However, they are still talking about whether to revive that. Then there are channels involving countries like Qatar on children. There have been prisoner exchange deals mediated by the Emiratis, by the Saudis and others. And on the nuclear front, you have the IAEA with personnel in Zaporizhia. So it's, as Simone said, the communique from this weekend sort of provides a bit more clarity about how Ukraine and its friends would like to see these issues discussed and resolved, but the channels are already there. And I mean, we have heard that actually the Qataris and some others were a bit nervous that the net result of the communique might be to politicize and complicate discussions that had previously been quite pragmatic and quite technical. So there is a risk the communique is counterproductive in that way. As I say, in terms of next steps, there probably will be a General Assembly resolution on nuclear safety coming up as an add-on to the summit outcome. Diplomats have asked in New York whether they should do a General Assembly resolution on the protection of children, but the answer that has come back from the US and others, no, because there are children in Gaza. And if we do a UN resolution on children in Ukraine, there's going to be a counter-resolution on children in Gaza. There aren't any nuclear power plants in Gaza, so that is the issue on which it's possible to have a resolution. But as Alyssa said, the Middle East is there, complicating some of these discussions.
Okay, well, next question. This one comes from Viera Volchanova, who is a regional analyst for INSO Ukraine, and who's asking about China's peace plan and its effort to gather signatories for it, whether that is has any impact on the Ukraine-led processes. Is there kind of an alternative where other countries are looking to the Chinese plan? And since Richard has been talking a lot, I'll see if Simone has any thoughts on this, or Alyssa, and then we'll come back to Richard to see if he has anything to add to it. Actually, if Fadeg can also jump in, but we'll start with Simone.
So far, the Chinese-led plans and the recent one with together with Brazil have been so vague that it's really hard to imagine what kind of impact they might have. And actually, they've been much more a list of principles of how to get to negotiations rather than what to negotiate about. It's basically a list of behavioral principles on the way to. So they might be not mutually exclusive in terms of content, but of course they would probably dig away its other signatories, and in that respect they might undermine each other actually.
Anyone want to add to that, Alyssa?
I mean, I just take a sort of a step back and point out, that these aren't real peace processes as long as both sides aren't willing to sit down. And, both sides' theory of victory at the moment is to outlast the other. For Russia, that certainly means waiting and seeing what comes of elections in Europe, but most importantly, elections in the United States, and whether that change any dynamic. I think, Putin is very convinced that time is on his side. And we have seen the reality that sort of the current cost of attrition and attritional warfare has really fallen on Ukraine pretty heavily. I think Zelensky made some comments that acknowledged that in recent weeks, and certainly after this weekend's summit, with facing issues with the mobilization, facing issues with a reliable flow of weapons for the long term, with modernizing and training its military at the same time as trying to hold the front lines. So at the risk of saying what we all on this call, and I'm sure the participants as well know well, this is sort of a different battleground, a diplomatic battleground, but it's not a real negotiating effort at the moment.
Oleg or Richard, anything to add to that?
On China, sorry. I think there was a Russian communique, a Russia-Chinese communique when Putin came to Beijing, yes, and there was a statement from China and Brazil. And China it's very clear, yes, that they support any direct dialogue between Russia and Ukraine from the one hand, and from the other hand, they say that like Russia's security concerns in Europe should be not accepted, should be discussed, yes, at least. And this is China's plan right now. So because what we've seen in last year, yes, what we've seen last year, it was quite vague, despite Russia formally endorsed this plan, yes.
Richard?
Yeah, I would just add, in addition to keeping an eye on China, one should keep an eye on Brazil. Brazil, as the war has gone on, has gradually sort of tilted more and more towards calling for direct dialogue without preconditions. The Brazilians and the Chinese put out sort of talking points on this in May. As Simone said, they were very vague, but it was striking that Brazil, which had previously backed UN resolutions affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity, supported this joint statement with China, which made no reference to Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, normally we probably wouldn't worry that much about what Brazil was thinking about the war, but Brazil is the G20 chair, and there is still a G20 summit that's going to take place in mid-November, just after the US elections, which could be quite an interesting affair, depending on what happens in the US vote. But it wouldn't surprise me if Lula attempts to use that event as a hook for some sort of new peace push around Ukraine. And especially if it comes after a Trump win, that push would come at a very, very delicate moment for the friends of Kiev.
Thank you. Okay, next question is from Suzanne Geis of Pathfinders for Peace and also an independent conflict resolution specialist, who writes, the Western theory is that if a peace deal allows Russia to keep control of territory it has occupied militarily, that will weaken the norm of territorial integrity and invite further conquest by Russia or others. Do you agree? I would say yes, but I'll let the panelists expand on that and how that works. And I think I'll start with Oleg and say, Oleg, do you think Russia is going to feel empowered to press its luck elsewhere, or not? It'll be perfectly satisfied with whatever it gets in whatever deal.
In terms of Ukraine, yes, I think so. What choice do they have? So,
well, they could wait and then start doing this again.
It's possible. We can't exclude this. Yes, it depends how their peace or deal or an agreement would look like. So we don't know. Yes, we can only speculate here. Yes, some people think that it's like a temporary solution, and if even like after Putin, yes, his successor, and if Russia still have problems with Ukraine, or conflict will continue anyway, yes, of course. So it will be a problem for Putin's successor of the next generation, like of Russian elite. So it could not be excluded that we'll see another conflict in the future. So not especially after such a devastating war. Yes, but we can only speculate here, unfortunately, because we don't know the deal, they don't know the agreement, so we don't know who will participate, we don't know the guarantees, we don't know how both countries will get out from this war, in which conditions.
Do others agree? I'm wondering if anybody else wants to weigh in on this.
Well, I think you should, Olya, talk about the European security, but just to prompt you, I guess I will say, first, obviously, it has to be an agreement that Ukraine is signing up to and not under duress. I think that's really important. But also, if we look at the wider regional dynamics, we at Crisis Group, and we've talked about that amongst ourselves, Odia, we'll build on it, do worry about future prospects for Moldova, for Georgia, for surrounding countries. So based on the outcome.
I mean, yes, I think I also, I guess, I think a way to think about this is you can see outcomes where Russia retains control de facto, right? But nobody recognizes that control. Does that undermine norms of territorial integrity? It does, absolutely. Does that potentially embolden Russia or others to do this again? Yes, absolutely. Because if you can do it, you can do it, right? Nothing happens to you. But is it, is it still a better outcome than everyone agreeing to the conquest? Also, yes, absolutely. And I think what Oleg is talking about is if you also pair this with things that make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to grab more territory, that also helps. But overall, it's a bad outcome if that happens. It does undermine the norm. Of course it does. How could conquest not undermine the norm against conquest? So the question is, if that's the direction you're stuck going in, if there's no alternative to that, how do you mitigate the damage it does? Let's see what, having answered a question. So Evan Grant is asking about the impact, and who does not identify an affiliation, but is asking about the impact of Ukrainian and Russian lobbying at UN headquarters and within UN agencies, whether that's something with a substantial impact. So I'll ask Richard to answer that one as our UN specialist.
Well, it was notable that one person who didn't visit Switzerland this weekend was Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. He sent the Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, in his place. And DiCarlo has participated in some of the warm-up meetings for the Swiss summit. But I think it was symbolically quite important that Guterres wasn't there. Why did he not go? There may have been personal reasons, but I think the political reason was that with Russia not attending and with China not attending, he felt that as a representative of an organization that is meant to be inclusive, and frankly, as someone who has to worry about what the P5 do in the Security Council, he couldn't be there. What we had heard was that if China had sent a participant, Guterres might have gone, but as it was, he did not do so. I mean, the UN is stuck in a very difficult situation over the war. Guterres did have an early diplomatic success with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but that fell apart last year, and he's not been able to revive it. The UN is involved on quite a large scale, probably a larger scale than most people appreciate, in terms of humanitarian aid and assistance inside Ukraine. But no one, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, seem to want Guterres to act as a mediator. Earlier in the war, Mexico and others had sort of suggested he should mediate a solution, but that talk has gradually disappeared. And so I think that the UN leadership is stuck trying to navigate these very, very difficult relations in the Security Council, and they don't really have very, very many clear entry points to doing more diplomatically in the war at the moment.
Thank you. And Grant has clarified affiliation with the United Kingdom Defense Forum. Alyssa, did you want to jump in on Russian disinformation on this? And just folks, we're going to keep going for a little bit longer, but if you've got questions, get them in, please.
This is a slightly different answer to the question, but I mean, I don't know if Richard will want to come back, but I do think it does highlight, when we talk about lobbying, you know, and at the UN and in different international forums. I think it's worth highlighting the issue that Western governments have faced with Russian diplomats essentially spreading things that are not true, just blankly stating, you know, sometimes there's been fears that it's proper preparation for a false flag attempt, or, you know, but their presence at the UN, their presence in various formats does give a platform to make sort of these accusations. And sometimes it doesn't really matter if they're fact checked. It doesn't matter if there are vehement responses to that. The sheer fact of voicing it in credible, recognized diplomatic forum gives weight and allows some of these messages about who's to blame for the war, what's behind it, all of these other narratives, a lot of airtime and space.
And let me just jump in and say, Alyssa, that you know, the Russians do come to the Security Council and, you know, spread quite a lot of misinformation. There have also been analyses of social media which shows that especially Chinese bots spread clips from the Security Council, and, you know, in many parts of the world, these little clips of what's happening at the UN do go viral and do shape public attitudes about the war. I mean, I would also just add one further point, which is, if you're Guterres and you're looking at the P5 at the moment, you're not only concerned about Russia's behavior towards Ukraine. There's a lot of concern now, and this is something we've written about at Crisis Group, that Russia is becoming more disruptive on other files in the Security Council, such as North Korea. And there is a real worry that as the war goes on, Russian-Western tensions are going to start blocking cooperation on a whole range of files, primarily around security, but possibly also around things like disarmament and development. So sensitivities are super high.
Thanks. Speaking of things that Crisis Group has written, we have a question from Ben Stokes of Sheffield University, drawing on our recent report, How to Hold the Line in Ukraine, which I do recommend everyone go to our website, download and read. So what Ben is asking is that in our report, we talk about Europe preparing to compensate and sustaining Ukraine if the US ends up stepping back, potentially under a future American administration. And the question is to get a little bit of an expansion on what would that mean? What would Europe need to be ready to do specifically? How much of that is already happening? How soon it's feasible to imagine those things being put in place? And I'll ask Simone to take our first crack at that, and then others can weigh in if they'd like.
Well, I think first of all, it's important to say that Europe is maybe going to pick up some of the slack of US stepping back, but it's always going to be painfully felt on the Ukrainian battlefield, at least on the timeline for a new American administration that we're in now. And Europe expanding here means not opening wider its doors of the warehouses, but it really means building new factories, employing new people, and cranking up production of ammunition and air defense interceptors, doubling, threefold. So it's a big investment push ahead, and it really depends on these mostly private firms filling their order books, getting long-term contracts, and that has been an obstacle and something that has delayed the expansion of their production, and which has been now picking up, but we're behind the curve clearly. So that is in any event, probably the US stepping back would have to would force Ukraine to take an even more defensive posture than they're doing now. I think that's as far as I will let colleagues weigh in on this as well.
Alyssa, do you have anything you might want to add on that?
No, I mean, I think that Simone has laid out the main points. It's just perhaps, you know, the conversations I think it's taken a long time for Europe to wake up to what it needed to do to really be able to continue to provide military and economic support to Ukraine at a level that it needed to, both to understand that it was going to be a very long conflict, that the counteroffensive wasn't going to deliver some magical solution last year, but also to understand that they couldn't just rely on the United States forever for their own security. So I think, you know, we have seen really this year a kind of the rhetoric and the perception and the action of countries in Europe really changing as they realize that this is an existential fight for them as well. I think where that wasn't maybe necessarily the case already, you know, a year ago. But again, there are a lot of things that the United States is doing that are very hard to replace. And, you know, within NATO, it's going to return, you know, to still the most important country. So it's not going to change overnight.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we are out of time. We've hit the 1 hour mark here. So I am sorry for any questions that we were not able to get to. I would like you to please join me in thanking our terrific speakers for their input. And thank all of you who joined us for taking part. As I said earlier, the event recording is going to be available shortly on our YouTube channel. It'll also be available on our regular website, crisisgroup.org/event recordings. Crisisgroup.org. If you click through to Ukraine and European security, you can also find our new report. So thank you again. I thought this was a really fantastic and rich conversation. And I appreciate everybody's inputs.